The luxurious hum of the private jet's engines filled the cabin as Marcus, a self-made black millionaire, reclined in his plush leather seat. The gleaming interior of the jet mirrored his success, with its polished walnut panels, gold accents, and soft lighting casting a warm glow. It had taken years of tireless effort, sleepless nights, and unyielding determination to reach this moment. As the son of a single mother from a modest neighborhood, Marcus had overcome countless obstacles to build a thriving tech empire. This flight marked the culmination of his latest achievement, a landmark deal that was set to open new doors not just for himself, but for countless others in his community. Despite the serene ambience, a subtle tension hung in the air, unnoticed by Marcus as he reviewed documents on his tablet. Meanwhile, Captain Harris, the jet's pilot, stood in the cockpit doorway, his gaze lingering on Marcus with a thinly veiled sneer. Harris had been a pilot for over 2 decades, but something about today's passenger grated on him in a way he couldn't quite explain, or maybe didn't want to admit. "Another one who thinks he's made it," Harris muttered under his breath, his tone dripping with disdain. It wasn't Marcus's wealth or his polished demeanor that bothered Harris. It was something deeper, something ugly and unspoken, a resentment born from years of harboring prejudices he refused to confront. As the flight attendants busied themselves preparing refreshments, Harris decided to step into the cabin under the guise of checking on his passenger. "Mr. Marcus," he began, his voice deceptively polite. "Everything all right so far?" Marcus looked up from his tablet, his warm smile genuine. "Everything's great. Thank you for asking." Harris nodded, but his forced smile barely masked his disdain. "First time flying private?" he asked, the question laced with condescension. Marcus chuckled, sensing the undertone but choosing to remain unbothered. "Not exactly. I've had the privilege a few times now, but I must say your team's attention to detail is impressive." The compliment landed flatly, unable to pierce through Harris's biases. "Well, we aim to please," he replied before quickly adding, "though I must admit, I was surprised when I saw your name on the manifest. Didn't expect someone like you to charter this particular jet." The words hung in the air, their meaning unmistakable. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Someone like me?" he repeated, his voice steady. Harris shrugged, feigning innocence. "You know what I mean. It's not every day we have passengers who climb the ladder so quickly. Must have been quite the leap." Marcus's smile faltered slightly, but he refused to take the bait. "Hard work and persistence," he said simply, his tone measured. "That's the ladder I climbed." Harris's smirk faded as he realized Marcus wasn't going to engage in the game he was trying to play. Frustrated, he excused himself and returned to the cockpit, muttering under his breath. Minutes passed, but the tension lingered. Marcus resumed his work, determined not to let the pilot's attitude ruin his mood. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the jet soared through the clouds, a sudden jolt rattled the cabin, causing Marcus to grip the armrest instinctively. The intercom crackled to life, and Harris's voice filled the cabin, calm but curt. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Please fasten your seatbelts." Marcus did as instructed, his instincts telling him this wasn't ordinary turbulence. He glanced out the window, the clear skies contradicting the pilot's announcement. His unease grew as the plane swayed again, this time more violently. Behind the scenes, in the cockpit, Harris smirked to himself. "Let's see how comfortable you are now," he muttered, adjusting the controls to create unnecessary turbulence. For him, it was a petty act of power, a way to rattle a passenger he couldn't stand seeing in such a position of success. But what Harris didn't anticipate was the swift and ironic turn of events that was about to unfold. A faint beeping sound interrupted his petty satisfaction, followed by a warning light flashing on the dashboard. His smirk vanished as he realized the jet's systems were indicating a serious mechanical issue, one that required immediate attention. The turbulence grew more severe, and in the cabin, Marcus could feel his heart pounding. Yet, he remained calm, his mind racing with thoughts of survival. The jet's elegant design now seemed more fragile than ever, and he knew that this moment could be a test of everything he'd built his life on: resilience, quick thinking, and faith. As the plane jolted again, Marcus reached for his phone, determined to record what might be his last moments, if only to leave a message for those he cared about. But what he didn't know was that karma was already working its magic. 5 minutes later, the man who thought he controlled the skies would be forced to face the consequences of his actions in a way he never imagined. In the cockpit, Captain Harris's confidence quickly began to waver. The warning light flashing on the control panel was no joke. A systems malfunction like this couldn't be ignored, even by someone with decades of experience. He adjusted his headset and radioed the nearest air traffic control tower. "This is Captain Harris, requesting immediate guidance. We're experiencing an unexpected mechanical issue," he said, his voice tinged with a nervous edge he tried to mask. The calm voice of the air traffic controller responded, "Roger that, Captain. We see you on radar. What's the nature of the malfunction?" Harris hesitated for a moment. How could he explain that the plane had been flying perfectly fine until he tampered with it out of spite? He chose his words carefully. It looks like a hydraulics issue. Stand by for further details." In the cabin, Marcus remained composed but alert. He could tell something wasn't right. He'd flown enough to recognize that turbulence like this didn't come out of nowhere, especially on a day with such calm skies. He glanced at the flight attendants, who were whispering to each other with concerned expressions, their usual professional demeanor slightly cracked. "Excuse me," Marcus called out to one of them, a young woman named Claire who had been polite and attentive throughout the flight. "Is everything okay? This feels unusual." Claire hesitated, her professional instincts battling with her genuine concern. "We're not entirely sure, Mr. Marcus. The captain mentioned a mechanical issue, but he hasn't provided specifics yet. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelt fastened." Marcus nodded, appreciating her honesty. "Thank you, Claire. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help." Claire managed a small smile before walking back toward the galley, but her worry was evident. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure. Years of running a business had taught him how to stay calm under pressure, but this was different. His life, and the lives of everyone on board, was in someone else's hands. Meanwhile, Harris was beginning to sweat. The situation was escalating quickly, and his attempts to regain control of the jet's systems were failing. His smug satisfaction from earlier had evaporated, replaced by a gnawing sense of panic. He knew he had made a mistake, but admitting it now could jeopardize his career, not to mention the lives of his passengers. He clenched his jaw, gripping the controls tighter. "What's going on back there, Captain?" the co-pilot, a younger man named Jeremy, asked. Unlike Harris, Jeremy had no idea about the pilot's earlier antics. He was focused solely on solving the problem. "Nothing I can't handle," Harris snapped, not meeting Jeremy's eyes. "Just focus on monitoring the instruments." Jeremy frowned but didn't push further. He could tell something wasn't adding up, but this wasn't the time to challenge the captain's authority. Instead, he focused on the navigation screens, scanning for any signs of a safe landing option. In the cabin, the turbulence continued, causing the plane to lurch unexpectedly. Drinks spilled, and a few overhead compartments popped open, sending small items tumbling to the floor. A collective murmur of unease spread among the passengers. Marcus noticed the unease and decided to address it. Standing carefully, he steadied himself against the swaying of the plane and spoke loudly enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "Everyone, I know this is a stressful situation, but we need to stay calm. Panicking won't help anyone. Let's trust the crew to handle this and follow their instructions." His voice was steady, filled with a quiet authority that seemed to reassure those around him. A few passengers nodded, visibly relaxing slightly. Marcus sat back down, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't do much from the cabin, but he felt a responsibility to stay composed for the sake of everyone else. Back in the cockpit, Harris was running out of options. The control panel lit up with more warnings, and the jet's movements became increasingly erratic. He couldn't ignore the irony of the situation. In his attempt to intimidate Marcus and assert his superiority, he had inadvertently endangered everyone on board. Now, his own pride and recklessness were coming back to haunt him. Jeremy's voice broke through Harris's spiraling thoughts. Captain, we need to make a decision. The system's showing a critical failure in the landing gear hydraulics. We have to prepare for an emergency landing. Harris hesitated. He knew Jeremy was right, but admitting the severity of the situation felt like admitting defeat. Still, he had no choice. Fine, he muttered. Contact air traffic control and request clearance for an emergency landing. Jeremy immediately relayed the request, his calm demeanor in stark contrast to Harris' fraying nerves. The air traffic controller responded swiftly, directing them to a nearby airstrip equipped to handle emergency landings. As the plane began its descent, the tension in the cabin was palpable. The passengers clung to their armrests, some whispering prayers, others staring out the windows with wide eyes. Marcus remained calm, though his heart was pounding. He could feel the gravity of the moment, the fragility of life hanging in the balance. Claire and the other flight attendants moved through the cabin, ensuring everyone was securely fastened and offering words of reassurance. When she reached Marcus, she paused, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Marcus, I just want to say, thank you for staying calm and helping keep everyone else calm too." Marcus nodded, appreciating her words but not letting himself dwell on them. "We'll get through this," he said firmly, more to himself than anyone else. In the cockpit, Harris gripped the controls tightly, his knuckles white. His mind raced with conflicting thoughts, fear for his life, guilt over his actions, and a desperate hope that they would survive this ordeal. For the first time in years, he felt utterly powerless. As the runway came into view, the plane continued to shudder, its damaged systems barely holding together. Jeremy took over most of the landing procedures, his calm efficiency a stark contrast to Harris's growing panic. But just as the jet began its final approach, another warning light flashed on the control panel, this time signaling a potential engine failure. Harris's breath caught in his throat as he realized the stakes had just risen even higher. The passengers had no idea how close they were to disaster. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, silently praying for the strength to face whatever came next. He didn't know it yet, but the events of the next few minutes would change the lives of everyone on board and force Harris to confront the truth he'd been avoiding for so long. The jet descended further, the ground rushing closer with every passing second. The cabin was eerily silent now, except for the hum of the engines and the occasional creak of the plane's strange structure. Passengers exchanged nervous glances, some gripping their armrests, others clutching their loved ones. Marcus kept his gaze fixed out the window, his mind churning through the possibilities. He didn't like feeling helpless, but this situation was entirely out of his hands. In the cockpit, Jeremy's focus was razor-sharp as he guided the plane toward the emergency runway. The young co-pilot's confidence in his skills was reassuring, but Harris's growing agitation was becoming a liability. Jeremy could sense the captain's internal battle, a mix of guilt, fear, and stubborn pride threatening to overwhelm him. "Captain, we've got this," Jeremy said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension. "I just need you to back me up." Harris nodded stiffly, but his hands trembled on the controls. He was a seasoned pilot, yet at this moment, he felt like a rookie facing his first real test. He couldn't shake the weight of his earlier actions, the knowledge that he had set this chain of events in motion. For the first time in his career, Harris doubted himself, and that doubt was dangerous. The air traffic controller's voice crackled through the headset. "Captain Harris, you are cleared for emergency landing on runway 14. Winds are light, conditions are optimal. Proceed with caution." Jeremy responded calmly, confirming their approach. He glanced at Harris, who was still visibly tense. "Captain, the landing gear is unresponsive. We'll need to brace for impact." Harris' eyes widened. "What? No, there's got to be another way." "There isn't," Jeremy said bluntly. "We need to focus. We don't have time for hesitation." Harris swallowed hard, nodding again. He couldn't bring himself to admit out loud, but Jeremy was the one holding things together now. Harris felt like a bystander in his own cockpit, a painful irony for someone who had spent his life believing he was always in control. In the cabin, Claire's voice broke the tense silence as she addressed the passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, we are making an emergency landing. Please remain seated, keep your seatbelts fastened, and brace yourselves by leaning forward with your hands over your head." The passengers obeyed, their movements mechanical as fear gripped them. Marcus adjusted his position, his thoughts flashing to his family and friends. He thought of his mother, who had worked multiple jobs to give him a better life. He thought of the team at his company, the people who had trusted him to lead them to success. And then he thought of the pilot. Something about Harris's earlier behavior didn't sit right with him. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this situation than bad luck. As the jet neared the runway, the tension in the cockpit was palpable. Jeremy's hands moved swiftly over the controls, his voice steady as he called out instructions. Harris responded automatically, his years of training kicking in despite his inner turmoil. But just as they prepared to touch down, a new warning light flashed. A sudden drop in engine power. The jet lurched violently, sending a ripple of panic through the cabin. Claire and the other flight attendants worked quickly to keep the passengers calm. But even they were struggling to stay composed. Marcus clenched his jaw, his instincts screaming that something was deeply wrong. In the cockpit, Jeremy's voice rose slightly, the first hint of alarm breaking through his calm exterior. "We're losing thrust. Captain, we need full focus here." Harris snapped out of his daze, his hands gripping the controls with renewed determination. "I've got it," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Together, they fought to stabilize the plane, the runway now just a few hundred feet away. As the jet made contact with the ground, the impact was jarring. The tires screeched, sparks flying as the damaged landing gear struggled to hold. Passengers screamed, the cabin rattling violently as the plane skidded down the runway. Marcus braced himself, his heart pounding as he tried to remain calm. But the ordeal was far from over. The jet veered slightly to the left, its compromised systems making it nearly impossible to control. In the cockpit, Jeremy worked frantically to keep the plane on course, his hands moving in a blur over the controls. Harris's face was pale, his earlier arrogance replaced by raw fear. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jet came to a shuddering halt. The cabin was filled with stunned silence, broken only by the faint hum of the engines winding down. For a moment, no one moved, as if they couldn't quite believe they had survived. Claire was the first to spring into action, unbuckling her seatbelt and addressing the passengers. "Everyone, please remain seated until we can safely evacuate. The crew will assist you." Marcus exhaled slowly, his muscles aching from the tension. But his relief was short-lived. He noticed Harris stepping out of the cockpit, his face ashen. The captain avoided eye contact, mumbling something about needing to check the exterior of the plane. Marcus's eyes narrowed. There was something off about Harris's demeanor, something that hinted at a deeper truth. As the passengers began to disembark, Marcus hung back, his instincts telling him to stay behind. He approached Claire, his voice low. "Can I have a word with the captain?" Claire hesitated, her professionalism warring with her own concerns. "Mr. Marcus, I think it's best if you—" "Please," Marcus interrupted gently. "It's important." Claire nodded reluctantly, motioning toward the exit where Harris was standing. Marcus approached him, his steps deliberate. When Harris turned to face him, Marcus saw the guilt in his eyes, the cracks in his carefully maintained facade. "Captain," Marcus began, his tone calm but firm, "I need to know what really happened up there." Harris stiffened, his jaw tightening. "I don't know what you're talking about." Marcus didn't back down. "You and I both know this wasn't just a mechanical failure. Something else was going on. I could see it in your face during the flight." Harris' eyes darted nervously, his shoulders tensing. For a moment, it seemed like he might confess, but then he shook his head. "I have no idea what you're implying," he said stiffly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have procedures to follow." Marcus stepped aside, watching as Harris walked away, but he wasn't convinced. Something about the captain's behavior didn't add up, and Marcus was determined to get to the bottom of it. As he stood on the tarmac, the wind whipping around him, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. As the passengers gathered on the tarmac, the relief of survival slowly gave way to curiosity and lingering unease. People exchanged murmurs of speculation, their voices hushed but tinged with urgency. Marcus stood apart from the group, his sharp gaze following Captain Harris as he walked toward a group of airport officials. Harris' stiff posture and clipped tone caught Marcus's attention. Something was definitely off, and Marcus felt a growing need to uncover the truth. The emergency response team had begun inspecting the jet, their flashlights sweeping over the damaged landing gear and the blackened patches on the tires. One of the engineers shook his head, muttering something into a radio. Marcus's curiosity piqued. He approached the group cautiously, careful not to overstep, but unable to suppress his urge to investigate. "Excuse me," he said, addressing one of the engineers. "Do you have any idea what caused the malfunction?" The engineer glanced at him, momentarily hesitant. "We're still assessing the situation, sir. It looks like there was a hydraulic failure in the landing gear, but there's some unusual damage here. We'll need more time to figure it out." Marcus nodded, though his mind was already racing. Unusual damage? That didn't sound like an ordinary mechanical issue. He turned his attention back to Harris, who was now gesturing animatedly, his voice rising as he spoke with the officials. Even from a distance, Marcus could sense the tension in the captain's words. Harris was defensive, almost desperate, and it only added to Marcus's suspicions. As the conversation continued, one of the officials, a woman with a stern expression and a no-nonsense demeanor, nodded and gestured for Harris to follow her. They disappeared into the airport building, leaving Marcus standing in the fading sunlight. He glanced back at the passengers, who were being escorted to a holding area for questioning and medical checks. The tension among them was palpable, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the real story was unfolding elsewhere. Determined to get answers, Marcus followed at a distance, slipping into the building through a side entrance. The sterile corridors were eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of fluorescent lights. He kept his steps light, his senses on high alert. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he trusted his instincts to guide him. As he approached a partially open door, he heard voices, low and urgent. Marcus pressed himself against the wall, straining to listen. "Can't believe you let it get this far," the woman's voice said, sharp and accusatory. "Do you have any idea how much trouble you're in?" "I didn't mean for it to happen," Harris replied, his voice cracking. "It was a mistake, a stupid, careless mistake." "A mistake," the woman repeated incredulously. "This isn't a minor error, Captain. Lives were at stake. You need to come clean about what happened up there." There was a long pause, and Marcus's heart pounded as he processed the exchange. Harris had admitted to something, though the details were still unclear. Marcus leaned closer, his curiosity outweighing his caution. "I didn't think it would go this far," Harris finally said, his voice barely audible. "I just wanted to send a message." Marcus's breath caught in his throat. A message? What kind of message could justify endangering an entire plane full of people? His mind raced as he pieced together the clues, the pilot's hostile demeanor, the strange mechanical issues, the engineer's comment about unusual damage. It all pointed to something deliberate, something personal. The woman's voice broke through his thoughts. "You realize this is serious, don't you? Tampering with the aircraft, endangering passengers. This isn't just about your career anymore. This is criminal." Harris didn't respond, but the silence spoke volumes. Marcus's stomach churned as the weight of the situation settled over him. The man who had been entrusted with their lives had intentionally jeopardized them. But why? What could drive someone to such reckless behavior? Suddenly, the door creaked open, and Marcus barely had time to step back before the woman stormed out, her expression grim. She didn't notice him as she walked briskly down the hallway, leaving Harris alone in the room. Marcus hesitated, torn between confronting the pilot and staying hidden. Before he could decide, Harris emerged, his face pale and drawn. He didn't see Marcus as he headed in the opposite direction, his steps unsteady. Marcus followed him at a safe distance, his mind racing. He needed to confront Harris, but he also needed to ensure there was evidence to back up his suspicions. As Harris made his way toward a secluded exit, Marcus quickened his pace, his resolve strengthening with each step. When they were outside, away from the noise and chaos of the emergency response teams. Marcus finally spoke. "Captain Harris." Harris froze, his shoulders tensing. Slowly, he turned to face Marcus, his expression a mixture of fear and defiance. "What do you want?" he demanded, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "I want the truth," Marcus said calmly. "I overheard your conversation. You tampered with the plane, didn't you?" Harris' eyes darted around, as if searching for an escape route. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, though his tone was unconvincing. Marcus took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "This isn't just about me, Harris. This is about everyone who was on that plane. Their lives, their families. You owe us an explanation." Harris's composure cracked, and he let out a bitter laugh. "You wouldn't understand," he muttered. "You think you're so perfect, don't you? Successful, admired, untouchable. People like you don't know what it's like to feel invisible, to be passed over again and again." Marcus frowned, his confusion growing. "What are you talking about?" Harris's voice rose, his anger spilling out. "You don't get it. I've worked my whole life to get where I am. And people like you just waltz in and take everything. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I just wanted to remind you that people like me matter too." The words hung in the air, heavy with bitterness and regret. Marcus stared at Harris, struggling to process the twisted logic behind his actions. This wasn't just about a grudge. It was about a man consumed by resentment and insecurity, willing to risk everything to make a point. But before Marcus could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted them. Harris's face turned pale as two airport security officers appeared, their expressions stern. "Captain Harris, we need you to come with us," one of them said. Harris didn't resist as they escorted him away, his head bowed in defeat. Marcus watched him go, a mixture of relief and sadness washing over him. The truth had come out, but the damage had already been done. And yet, the story was far from over. Marcus knew there were still questions to be answered, still pieces of the puzzle to fit together. And he was determined to see it through, no matter what it took.